It's like some of you might recall that if you go home and your significant other says to you, gee, you look crabby, dear, or irritable, and you what? You snap back, no, I'm not irritable, all right? I'm not crabby, all right? And this is that decreased self-monitoring. We don't realize how we're coming across because of being overwhelmed with the experiences and not being able to process them. The next category is social impact. As all of us know in this work, collaboration is like the key word. But as our pediatrician at our trauma center would say, the appearance of collaboration is not necessarily collaboration. So reduction in collaboration means I don't want to work with others because my brain is built on my survival, and my survival is built on me taking care of me. And so reduction in collaboration comes about when I am not thriving or I'm not growing in my position, but I'm just trying to survive the day. And I don't want other input. I don't want other people to make this more complex. And so this is oftentimes this kind of social isolation that develops A, in an office itself, or B, even at home, which is the next one, withdrawal and loss of social support, is that I don't want to be nearly as social as I used to be. I'm talking to people all day, I'm engaged with people all day. This really takes my energy. I'm giving, I'm not receiving, and so we tend to avoid other circumstances outside of work that we might historically have been involved in. As one woman said to me, you know, I've thought for the last 10 years I'm going crazy because when I get home, I pull the blinds, I shut the door, I turn the phone off, and I just kind of vegetate till the next day of work. And when we began to talk about secondary trauma, she began to realize that what she was really doing was a response given her own survival in trying to make it through this as a way to regroup. And so that it's not that something was wrong with her, is that she was overwhelmed and certainly couldn't manage to have this kind of ongoing social interaction. The other, which is always interesting when you communicate to people the kind of work you do, and that you work with traumatized kids or adults, people often don't want to talk to you further at a party. It's like, oh, thanks, that's interesting, must be hard work, I'll see you later. This is because what? Our culture doesn't embrace the work we do. We need somebody to do it, but it doesn't embrace the impact of the pain. And our society doesn't want to hear the stories repeatedly. It wants to tighten it up neatly in a package, say it exists, but I don't want to hear about it. And we who do this work are involved every day, and so there's this kind of withdrawal socially because it's not really accepted in the context of our experience. And the last one is that factionalism, which is really has to do with the threat focus under cognitive effects, that we tend to then draw lines, us against them. And this becomes really significant in an office where people then begin to draw clear boundaries and miss the opportunity to gain support from one another, which was really important in managing secondary traumatic stress. The third area is the emotional impact. I talked earlier about the helplessness, how this work puts us in positions of helplessness, feeling that we can't really make a difference, even though we started this work to do that. And then comes hopelessness. Oh my goodness, how is it that anything ever is going to change for this kid, for this family? That we begin to think, gee, everybody else has been trying, nobody's been successful. What makes me think that this is going to be different? So we really know that helplessness and hopelessness that are unattended really take our energy away, really impact our motivation, really impact how much investment we really put into things as a way to help us manage and survive. And so there's real loss in that commitment if we're really experiencing this ongoing hopelessness and helplessness. And the last part of this is feeling overwhelmed. In doing this with many folks, thousands of folks, and kind of asking them which category feels like they belong, is the majority experience the emotional impact and this feeling overwhelmed, like I just can't do it all. And when we can't feel like we can't do it all, we shut down, and then we're even less effective and less efficient in this process. And the last category is really my favorite, which is oftentimes with emotional impact, the two primary areas that are most often seen our physical impact, the headaches, tense muscles, obviously stomach aches, sleep issues. We talk about eating too much. The limbic system craves comfort. And most people say, gee, when I started this work, I gained weight. Why couldn't I have lost weight? Because we take stress into our bodies and it affects us. Sometimes it's drinking too much. We've all been that experience of, oh my God, you're not going to believe what happened. And as a way to manage, alcohol certainly tends to temporarily mitigate the effects of that. So these are all physical impacts that, because secondary trauma is stored in our body, they begin to come out. Now, if you have headaches or you don't sleep well or you just don't feel well, it's very likely that you're going to be negative, or it's very likely you're going to be irritable. And so these four categories are not mutually exclusive. Often people say, gee, I've got all of them. They start with one, they move to another, and suddenly it seems like I'm experiencing each one of these. And that's very common because it's not just one or the other. They blur into each other depending on the circumstance, depending on what your physical feeling is that day or your mood. So really important we see the globalness of these symptoms of secondary traumatic stress. The last thing I think as we look at these symptoms that I think is really important is if I say to you, which ones do you have? And like I said, most people say emotional or physical. But if I say, which one do you see most in your office? What almost inevitably happens is the vast majority say we see the cognitive effects, that it's mostly negative, people complaining, people unhappy. That's what we normally see, which my guess is it's really underneath that, the emotional and physical impact, but that's how it's manifested in the day-to-day work. This is a study that was also done by Ginny Strand, and what you see here I think is fascinating. These are from mental health centers across the country, that the number one and number two effects of secondary traumatic stress are pessimism, negativism about patients and clients, but equally negative and pessimism about coworkers. So it's very interesting, becomes somewhat of a reflection of the Lord of the Flies, that book and movie, that we begin to turn on ourselves. When we have all this, we have no language for it, we have not a permission to embrace it, then we tend to turn it on ourselves and others, to blame and creating this negative. The other, certainly avoidance of certain families. If something's triggering you, we tend to what? We tend to move away from it. Concentration, attention problems. My head is overwhelmed, I can't focus. Decreased collaboration, we talked about in terms of that just complicates. Or that excessive absenteeism, if I'm physically not well, the likelihood is increased tremendously that I'm not going to be at work. So this is diagram just is kind of a visual of how secondary traumatic stress and or primary traumatic stress can affect an office. So in the bottom circle there, that kind of orangish color, it's what we would call primary trauma, where staff have actually experienced a traumatic event. In other words, where they've been physically threatened, or they've been physically harmed, or that they've been exposed to a shooting in a house, that they're the primary recipients of the experience. Versus the blue, outer blue around it, the second layer, is where staff may have been involved previously with the family or are involved currently with the family who've experienced the event. And so this is where secondary trauma comes in, is where you have some awareness, and the more connection you have to that family and hearing their story, the more impact it's likely to have on you. And then we go to the purple. So what we know in human services is it can happen to one or two people, but quickly spreads throughout the office. Suicide is one that certainly you see in mental health. And suddenly everybody's talking suicide. Everybody's wondering, gee, are my consumers safe? So that affects and creates anxiety for everybody, especially in the unit where it's happened, in this kind of rippling effect, so that the impact of secondary traumatic stress is felt more significantly, which more challenges and conflicts occur in that way. So as I said earlier, this great myth busting of separating my personal from my professional life makes us, quote, feel better as we think, but in reality deceives us in not recognizing just what that impact is. It's interesting when people say they have physical symptoms, and a vast majority of people do say they have physical symptoms. Most everyone says, in the beginning I didn't think, or I didn't want to think it had anything to do with my work, until I started to really chart out when it was happening. And it certainly seems that it's work related. And so because we have this need to control, we don't want to believe that it can be popping out physically. And yet, if we don't acknowledge and embrace, it's likely to come out physically. So there's a quote from a human service professional I think is somewhat reflective of a continuum. I used to believe the world was basically fair and that people were basically good. Now I think fate is fickle and I don't trust anyone. So when you're exposed and you can't talk about that exposure, when you are overwhelmed and can't communicate what it's like for you, we begin to get beliefs based on self-protection, not growth. And this is, I think, something very important. The other part of this is that it can also be affected by a very intense case, so that it may not be every case, but the intensity of that case becomes so overwhelming that it colors and generalizes into each of my interactions with folks, and kind of this absorb all of that distrust by that particular case of somebody lying to me that I believed in, and then generalizes into my other situations. So Daniel Siegel, brain expert, has a great line: to name something is to begin to tame it. So what I've been talking about is naming secondary trauma, because until we have something that we can view as this is what it is, this is the phenomena, we really can't do much about it. And so when we begin to say, yes, this is secondary trauma, wow, if it is, now here's how it's manifesting. Now what do I do to begin to recognize that there are some things that I can do to acknowledge and to move forward? The other part of this, in this acknowledgement, is a very powerful statement from a book that was written by a businessman on the workforce environment. And what he said was, unavoidable pain within the workplace that is unaddressed creates a toxic work environment. Now, those of us in human service professions know that our work is constantly about the pain of other people. We bring that pain with us. We absorb it, as I was saying a second ago. And the question is, so where do we let go of that pain? And what do we do to let go of it in a healthy way, versus what happens when we don't let it go, or we let it go in unhealthy ways? And so this takes a real commitment from folks within the office, from folks outside of an office, to say, what is happening here? What pain is here? How are we addressing? And how do we move to that support for one another in this context? What goes hand in hand with secondary traumatic stress is organizational stress. Sandra Bloom, the founder of Sanctuary, a trauma-informed organizational model, says organizational stress comes from complex interaction between traumatized children, stressed staff, pressured organizations, and oppressive social and economic environment. So if we were going to really acknowledge the present state of human service, I would think most people would agree that these are the interactions on an ecological, in an ecological way, that one affects the other, that affects the other, that affects the other, and they're all affecting each other, is that our work is oftentimes not embraced in mainstream society as necessary, and that the people we work with, sometimes even children, the perception is, well, if they wanted to, they could do something differently. And yet, those of us who work in the field know that trauma changes the brain, trauma impacts decision making, trauma impacts my perception of reality, and those are the very things that undermine success in our society. And so we don't get the support because people don't understand trauma, and we're faced with it both on an individual level, on an organizational level, and certainly on a community level. Those of you in mental health know last year the general funds were cut significantly. Does that mean that people don't need them anymore? No, not at all. Does that mean that those in power recognize that our kids and our adults are traumatized and need help? No. Does it mean that we want to spend our money other than the well-being of children and families sometimes? Absolutely. So this is the process of what happens and can really lead to being overwhelmed with that organizational stress.